911, what is your emergency? I need the police. My husband's been shot. I know my dad. Her husband's been shot by an unknown male.
And we see a body on the floor.
His name is Jon.
Jon what?
Garner.
You're still warm.
It was a cold January night in 2018. The town of Maypearl, Texas, lay silent under the vast starless sky. Inside a modest suburban home, Sandra Garner and her husband Jon were fast asleep. It was just another ordinary night until the sound of gunfire shattered the peace. Sandra woke up to the deafening noise, her heart pounding. Disoriented and terrified, she turned to her husband, only to see him lying motionless beside her. Blood was spreading across the bed. Before she could react, a dark figure loomed over her, a masked intruder holding a gun. The metallic scent of gunpowder still hung in the air. "Don't move. If you scream, you're dead." Sandra froze. Her mind raced. Was this really happening, or was it a nightmare? The intruder barked out demands, his voice sharp like a blade. He wanted money. He wanted valuables. But most of all, he wanted her silence. Trembling, Sandra nodded. She did everything he asked. She handed over what little cash they had. She gave him access to their belongings, anything to stay alive. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man fled into the darkness, vanishing like a ghost. Sandra dialed 911, her voice shaking. She could barely get the words out. "There's been a break-in. My husband. He's been shot." Emergency responders arrived within minutes. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night. Officers stormed inside, weapons drawn, clearing the house. Paramedics rushed to Jon, but it was too late. Jon Garner, a beloved father, husband, and military veteran, was gone. The police immediately began their investigation. Sandra was devastated, her eyes swollen with tears as she recounted what happened. He just appeared out of nowhere. He shot Jon, and then he held me at gunpoint. He told me to stay quiet. I thought I was going to die. The authorities took notes, searching for any clues that might lead to the masked intruder. A robbery gone wrong, a home invasion, a senseless act of violence. But as the hours passed, the investigators started to notice something. Something that didn't quite add up. Sandra's story seemed convincing, but the evidence at the scene? It told a different tale. As investigators combed through the crime scene, they started noticing small inconsistencies. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. How had the intruder gotten inside? Detectives pressed Sandra for details. She described the masked man again, his voice deep, his demands clear. "He told me to stay quiet, or he would kill me too." But there was one thing that caught the detectives' attention. Sandra claimed the intruder had forced her to wait in the bathroom while he escaped. That's when they made a shocking discovery. In Sandra's car, tucked away inside a secret compartment, they found something unexpected, a .38 caliber handgun, a gun that matched the bullets found in Jon Garner's body. When confronted, Sandra's face went pale. "Sandra, can you explain this?" She hesitated, stammered, but she had no answer. The police now had a new theory. What if there was no masked intruder? What if this wasn't a random home invasion? Sandra was taken into custody. She maintained her innocence. She sobbed. She swore she was telling the truth, but the evidence was stacking against her. Then another twist. Phone records revealed something chilling. Just days before Jon's death, Sandra had been researching something suspicious online. She had searched how to kill someone and get away with it. It was damning, too damning to ignore. But the biggest question remained, why? Why would Sandra kill her husband? Investigators started digging into the couple's past. That's when they uncovered a possible motive, Jon's life insurance policy. A policy worth $250,000. Had it all been a carefully staged crime? Had Sandra fabricated the entire break-in to cover up her own actions? The evidence was pointing in one direction. Sandra Garner wasn't a victim. She was the prime suspect. And so, a grieving widow transformed into an accused murderer. But could the prosecution prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt? Or was there still room for doubt? With Sandra now in custody, the case against her started coming together. Prosecutors believed they had everything they needed: a suspicious 911 call, an inconsistent story, the murder weapon hidden in her own car, and those damning internet searches. But was it enough for a conviction? Sandra's defense team had a different story to tell. They argued that the police had rushed to judgment, that Sandra was a grieving widow, not a calculating killer. Her attorney pointed out that the gun found in her car had no fingerprints linking it to her. No gunshot residue was found on her hands the night of the murder. And then, there was the biggest issue, the lack of a clear motive. Yes, Jon had a life insurance policy, but Sandra didn't seem to be in financial distress. Their relationship, according to friends and family, didn't seem to be filled with turmoil. The defense pushed back hard. There is no direct evidence tying Sandra to this crime. The state's case is built on circumstantial evidence and assumptions. And then, another shocking turn. A forensic expert took the stand and pointed out something crucial, the possibility of gunpowder contamination. The firearm was recovered from a car that had been searched multiple times by different officers. There is a possibility that the evidence was accidentally transferred. Could it be true? Had investigators made mistakes? For days, both sides presented their arguments. Witnesses testified. The jury listened carefully. And then, after hours of deliberation, they reached a verdict. The courtroom fell silent. Sandra sat motionless, her hands trembling. We, the jury, find the defendant, Sandra Garner, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Sandra broke down in tears. She had just walked free. But not everyone believed in her innocence. To this day, many still wonder, did Sandra truly escape justice, or was she genuinely the victim of a flawed investigation? That's the unsettling part about some cases. Sometimes, even with all the evidence in the world, the truth remains just out of reach. And that leaves us with one final question. What do you believe? Sandra Garner walked out of that courtroom a free woman. But freedom didn't mean everything went back to normal. Her life had been shattered. Her husband was gone. Her name had been dragged through the mud. And the town she lived in? Well, people weren't so quick to forget. Some saw her as the grieving widow who had been wrongfully accused. Others saw her as someone who had just gotten away with murder. Her son, Wesley, remained convinced that his mother was innocent. He had stood by her throughout the trial. My mom didn't do this. The police made a mistake. But was Wesley blinded by love for his mother? Many found it hard to ignore the evidence. The gun in her car, the internet searches, the inconsistencies in her 911 call. It was all too much to dismiss. Yet, the court had spoken. The jury had found reasonable doubt, and in the eyes of the law, Sandra Garner was innocent. But there was one more question lingering in the air. If Sandra didn't kill Jon, then who did? The alternative theory, the masked intruder, had been dismissed by the prosecution as a fabrication. But what if Sandra was telling the truth? Could it be possible that police had gotten it wrong, that the real killer had escaped justice? Or was it that the truth had been staring us in the face all along, and the system had simply failed to act on it? Cases like this leave us with more questions than answers. Justice isn't always clear-cut. Sometimes the guilty walk free, and sometimes the innocent are blamed for crimes they didn't commit. But in the end, one thing remains undeniable. Jon Garner is dead, and someone pulled the trigger. Who do you believe that? Or had the jury let a guilty woman walk free? Sandra Garner tried to move on with her life, but how do you move on when the world still whispers behind your back? Her case became a cautionary tale. Some saw her as a woman who had survived a horrific ordeal, both as a grieving widow and as someone falsely accused. But others saw something different, a cold-blooded killer who had outsmarted the system. Sandra left the town where she and Jon had lived together. Too many painful memories, too many accusing eyes, but her past would always follow her. The crime that took Jon Garner's life remained unsolved. Was there really a masked intruder that night? People debated the case for years. True crime enthusiasts, armchair detectives, and legal experts all analyzed every detail. Some believed the jury had been right. There wasn't enough proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Others were certain that Sandra had planned the murder meticulously, that she had hidden the gun in her car, and that she had fooled everyone. But the most haunting part? We may never know the truth. Jon Garner's death remains a mystery. The real killer, whoever they are, is still out there, whether it's Sandra or someone else. Justice is supposed to bring closure, but in this case, it only left a gaping hole. As the investigation continued, detectives took a closer look at Sandra's behavior in the hours and days following Jon's murder. While initial shock and grief were expected, something about her demeanor seemed rehearsed. She was emotional when speaking to police, yet her reactions felt inconsistent, crying at times but strangely composed when discussing details that would normally unsettle a grieving wife. Then came another critical moment in the case. The murder weapon, a .38 caliber pistol, was discovered inside the couple's home, hidden in a plastic bag in a closet. This was a huge contradiction to Sandra's original claim that the intruder had taken the gun with him when he fled. Why would a burglar execute a man and then leave the murder weapon behind? The discovery shifted the case dramatically. Investigators now had strong reason to believe that there was no intruder at all. Instead, it appeared that the crime scene had been staged. But there was still one major question left unanswered. Why would Sandra kill her husband? Friends and family initially struggled to believe she was involved. Sandra and Jon had been married for nearly 2 decades. By all appearances, they had a loving relationship. Jon was a devoted stepfather to Sandra's son, and they had recently celebrated their anniversary. However, a closer look into their financial situation revealed cracks beneath the surface. The couple had been experiencing financial strain, and Jon had a substantial life insurance policy. If Jon were to die, Sandra stood to receive a large payout, potentially enough to resolve any money troubles she faced. But was financial gain enough of a motive? Or was there something more personal behind it? As detectives dug deeper, they discovered another startling revelation. Sandra had a history of failed marriages, ones that had ended under unusual circumstances. There were whispers of previous domestic disputes, control issues, and hidden resentments. Then, the most damning evidence surfaced. Sandra's own son, who had initially supported her alibi, later changed his story. He admitted that he had seen his mother acting suspiciously in the hours after the murder. She was handling the very gun that was later found hidden in their home. With forensic evidence, inconsistencies in her story, and her own son's testimony against her, the case against Sandra was growing stronger. But one final question remained. Would the jury believe it? With the mounting evidence, investigators moved forward with an arrest. Sandra Garner was charged with the murder of her husband, Jon Garner. The small town of Maypearl, Texas, was shocked. Many had known Sandra as a loving wife, a mother, and an active community member. The idea that she could be capable of such a brutal act was almost unthinkable. As the trial approached, both the prosecution and the defense prepared their arguments. The prosecution's case rested on 3 key points. The murder weapon, the .38 caliber pistol, which Sandra claimed the intruder had taken, was found hidden inside her home. The inconsistencies in her story. Her description of the intruder didn't match any real suspects, and her behavior during interrogations raised suspicions. Her financial motive. Sandra stood to gain a significant amount from Jon's life insurance policy, which prosecutors argued was her primary reason for killing him. The defense, on the other hand, painted a very different picture. They claimed that Sandra was a grieving wife who had been manipulated by police into giving inconsistent statements. They pointed out that forensic evidence linking her directly to the shooting was weak. There were no gunshot residue tests confirming she had fired the weapon, and no witnesses saw her pull the trigger. But then, the most critical piece of evidence came to light, a Google search found on Sandra's iPad. The search history revealed something chilling: how to kill someone in their sleep. This discovery was damning. It suggested premeditation, directly contradicting Sandra's claim that the murder was the result of a random home invasion. Prosecutors argued that this proved she had planned Jon's death well before that fateful night. Still, Sandra maintained her innocence. She insisted that someone else must have used her device, or that the search was taken out of context. Her defense team worked tirelessly to create doubt, emphasizing that there was no clear forensic link between her and the murder. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for: the trial. As testimony unfolded, the courtroom became captivated by the battle between prosecution and defense. Friends and family took the stand, some in support of Sandra, others convinced of her guilt. The emotional weight of the case was undeniable. But what ultimately sealed her fate? The jury couldn't ignore the evidence, the staged crime scene, the hidden gun, the financial motive, and that damning Google search. After deliberating, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. Sandra Garner was sentenced to life in prison. Her reaction? A mix of shock and defiance. Even as she was led away, she maintained her innocence. But was justice truly served? Or was there still a lingering doubt about what really happened that night? As Sandra Garner was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the emotions in the room were intense. Jon Garner's family felt a sense of justice, but it was bittersweet. Nothing could bring him back. Sandra's supporters, however, believed that an innocent woman had just been sentenced for a crime she did not commit. In the days following the verdict, discussions about the case exploded online. True crime enthusiasts, legal analysts, and everyday people debated the evidence. Some pointed out that Sandra's motive seemed weak. Yes, she would inherit Jon's life insurance money, but would she really risk everything for that? Others argued that the lack of forensic evidence meant there was still reasonable doubt. The debate only intensified when Sandra filed an appeal. Her legal team claimed that the search history evidence had been mishandled and that investigators had been biased from the start, fixating on her as the prime suspect without considering alternative possibilities. They also questioned whether someone else could have planted the gun in her home, knowing it would incriminate her. Meanwhile, in prison, Sandra maintained her innocence. She gave interviews, speaking with reporters and crime podcast hosts, pleading her case to the public. One key question remained: if Sandra didn't do it, then who did? This question led some independent investigators and true crime bloggers to revisit the details of the night of the murder. Could there have been another suspect? A jealous ex? A financial enemy of Jon's? A completely random attack that was somehow staged to frame Sandra? But no alternative theory ever gained enough traction to change the case's outcome. The courts upheld Sandra's conviction, and she remained behind bars. However, this case serves as a chilling example of how circumstantial evidence, inconsistent statements, and digital footprints can seal someone's fate. In an era where technology tracks our every move, a single search history entry can become the defining piece of evidence in a murder trial. So, what lessons can we take from this case? The power of perception. Once the police or the public perceive someone as guilty, it can be nearly impossible to change that narrative. The weight of digital evidence, a Google search, a deleted message, or an online purchase history can become the deciding factor in a case. The importance of critical thinking. Not all convictions mean justice was served. There have been wrongful convictions in history, and sometimes the real truth remains hidden. Was Sandra Garner truly guilty, or was she just the perfect scapegoat for a crime that remains unsolved? As the years passed, Sandra Garner remained behind bars, her appeals repeatedly denied. But the questions surrounding the case never fully disappeared. True crime communities continued to analyze every detail, dissecting inconsistencies and scrutinizing the police work. Some believed that the investigators had developed tunnel vision, locking in on Sandra as their only suspect and failing to explore other possibilities. One of the biggest concerns raised was the timeline. The prosecution had argued that Sandra killed Jon, staged the scene, and then called 911. But could she really have done all of that in such a short window of time without leaving behind more obvious evidence? There was also the matter of the missing intruder. Sandra had initially described a masked man breaking in, holding her at gunpoint, and shooting her husband before fleeing. But police found no forced entry and no outside DNA at the scene. They dismissed her story as an elaborate lie. Yet some wondered, what if Sandra had seen something real that night? Something she couldn't fully remember. Experts in false confessions noted that people under extreme stress sometimes say things that are not entirely accurate. Trauma can cause memory lapses, and fear can lead to unintentional inconsistencies. Could Sandra have misremembered details under pressure, leading investigators to doubt her credibility? There was also debate about the gun. The murder weapon had been found inside Sandra's home, wrapped in a cloth inside a plastic bag. It was the same caliber as the one used in the killing, and it had Jon's blood on it. But forensic experts pointed out something unusual. The bag showed no signs of Sandra's fingerprints. If she had handled the gun and hidden it, wouldn't her prints have been on the bag? The defense had argued that the weapon could have been planted, but by whom and why? If Sandra was being framed, then someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she took the fall. Over time, the case became a cautionary tale about the complexities of justice. It highlighted how easily a suspect's behavior, her calm demeanor in interviews, her internet search history, her reaction to Jon's death, could be interpreted as guilt. It also showed how much power investigators have in shaping a case. The moment police decided Sandra was the prime suspect, every piece of evidence was viewed through that lens. In the end, Jon Garner's murder remains a tragedy with no perfect resolution. Either Sandra was a cunning killer who fooled people into believing she was innocent, or she was a woman wrongly convicted, spending the rest of her life behind bars for a crime she did not commit. The lesson? Justice is not always black and white. Cases like these remind us to question, to think critically, and to always consider the possibility that the truth may be more complicated than it appears. But what if Sandra was telling the truth all along? What if there really was an intruder that night, someone the police never identified? Some crime analysts pointed out that small Texas towns, like the one where Sandra and Jon lived, often lacked the sophisticated forensic resources of larger cities. Could investigators have missed crucial evidence in their rush to close the case? One particular aspect that remained puzzling was Sandra's behavior. Many who knew her insisted she had no history of violence, no known motive, and no prior incidents of aggression toward Jon. She was described as a loving wife who, even after his death, continued to speak about him with affection. Yet, the prosecution argued that financial difficulties and marital tension had provided Sandra with a motive. They pointed to the fact that she stood to benefit from Jon's life insurance policy. But was that enough? Plenty of people face financial struggles, and not all of them resort to murder. Another troubling element was the supposed confession. Sandra had denied killing Jon for hours during interrogation. But then, under the weight of exhaustion, fear, and psychological pressure, she suddenly admitted to it, only to retract her statement soon after. Experts in interrogation tactics note that false confessions are more common than people realize, especially when a suspect is subjected to prolonged questioning. Moreover, her internet search, "How to kill someone in their sleep," was damning. But context matters. Did she actually search that phrase, or was it taken out of context from something else she was researching? And even if she had searched for it, was it conclusive proof of murder? Or could it have been a morbid curiosity, as defense attorneys suggested? There were alternative theories. Some speculated that Jon had enemies, people from his past, or someone involved in a financial dispute. Perhaps someone had broken in that night, murdered him, and left before police arrived. But if that were true, why was there no forced entry? No clear evidence of another person? The most chilling possibility is the one that lingers in the minds of those who still debate the case. What if the true killer got away? What if Sandra was telling the truth when she described the masked intruder, but the police simply refused to believe her? In wrongful conviction cases, it is often the refusal to consider alternative suspects that leads to injustice. Investigators focus too quickly on one person, and in doing so, they may miss crucial leads. Now, years later, Sandra remains in prison, maintaining her innocence. Her case stands as a stark reminder of how fragile justice can be. Was Sandra Garner a cold-blooded killer, or was she a victim of a flawed investigation? Perhaps we'll never know. And that brings us to the end of today's story. But what do you think? Was Sandra truly guilty, or could there have been another explanation? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into true crime, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. And if you want to support the channel, share this video with a friend who loves mysteries as much as you do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.